She scrubbed herself with handfuls of mud, standing barefoot in the pig trough while her stepmother laughed from the porch. But she didn't cry. Not anymore. Not since the day her real mother stopped coming to tuck her in. Her name was Clara and she was 10 years old. That morning, like too many before it, she was covered in slop, humiliated by the only woman left in her life. She was a child stripped of everything but her name. Until one man, watching from the fence line, saw more than a filthy girl. He saw his daughter. Clara knew how to move without being seen, how to shrink herself, how to carry the bucket low, never splash, never speak unless spoken to. The farmhouse she lived in was big, painted white once upon a time, but now the siding peeled like burnt skin and the porch sagged. Inside were polished silverware and porcelain dolls belonging to her stepsisters, two girls who never lifted a finger. Clara cooked their breakfasts. Clara pressed their dresses. Clara fed their horses, but she didn't get to ride. This morning had started like every other, with the slap of cold water on her arms, the scrape of the broom against old oak floorboards, and her stepmother's voice slicing the morning stillness like a rusted blade. "Clara, you missed a spot again." Her stepmother, Miriam, had a way of smiling when she was cruel. She wore silk house robes and sat on velvet chairs while Clara knelt on the floor scrubbing spots that weren't even there. Today, though, the chores weren't enough. Today, Clara was told to clean the pig pen barefoot, since she loved the animals so much. That meant stepping into the slop, hauling the rotten feed, then washing herself with the same water the pigs drank from. And when she finished, Miriam locked the front door, again. That's when Clara wandered to the fence line, hair wet, feet caked in mud, stomach empty. The wind caught her white nightgown like a sail, and from across the field someone watched. His name was Thomas Hale, a rancher of few words and even fewer visitors. He lived alone on the edge of town with his son, Levi, whom he'd raised since the day his wife died giving birth. The man had not smiled in years. He wore grief like a coat. But that morning, as he passed the Brenshaw land, what folks in town called Miriam's little kingdom, he saw Clara. She wasn't crying, she wasn't begging, she was just standing quiet, alone. And something in that silence pierced him deeper than a scream ever could. Thomas dismounted his horse, took off his hat, and leaned against the fence. "You all right?" he asked. Clara flinched like a rabbit caught in a trap. She nodded without looking up. "Where's your ma?" he tried again. "She's not my ma," Clara whispered. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward the barn, shoulders hunched like she could vanish inside herself if she just bent far enough. That should have been the end of it, one stranger passing another, but Thomas didn't move. He watched her disappear through the barn door. He stood there long after his horse got restless. Something inside him itched like a memory trying to claw its way out. His boy, Levi, was only 8, and he remembered, clear as day, the first time Levi looked that small, that lost. Thomas mounted his horse, rode 3 miles into town and bought 2 sandwiches, a jar of jam, and a white cotton dress. He didn't know why. He returned as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the field. He approached the barn slow, cautious, like a man approaching a wounded animal. He didn't go inside, just left the food and dress by the door and walked away. Clara didn't eat that night. She waited until the moon rose and the crickets sang. Only then did she tiptoe to the barn door and find the bundle. Her hands trembled as she picked up the dress, soft and clean. She hadn't worn white since her mother's funeral. Inside the jar was a note. "For the girl who deserves more than mud." She read it again, pressed it to her chest. The next morning, Clara didn't put on rags. She wore the white dress. Her stepmother slapped her for it, called her a thief, tore it at the hem, but Clara never let go of the note. 3 days passed. Thomas came back. This time he didn't stop at the fence. He went straight to the barn. And he found Clara inside, holding the jar, asleep in the hay. He knelt beside her, whispered her name. Her eyes fluttered open. "You shouldn't be here," she said, She'll be angry." "I know," he replied, "but I don't scare easy." "Why'd you give me this?" Clara asked, holding up the note. Thomas looked at her like a man seeing something holy. "Because someone once told me I was worth saving," he said. "Figured maybe it was time to pass that on." She didn't cry, but something behind her eyes cracked. "You got a place to go?" he asked. She shook her head. "You want one," he said. And for the first time in months, Clara didn't feel cold. But before she could answer, a scream split the air. "Clara!" Miriam, closer than either of them had thought. Thomas stood, heart racing. Clara jumped to her feet. Heavy footsteps. She was coming. And she wasn't alone. Miriam's voice lashed through the barn doors like a whip across skin, raw and snapping with rage. She hadn't expected silence when she called for the girl. No, she wanted Clara to come crawling, eyes downcast, hands still stained with muck. Instead, she stepped into the barn and saw Clara standing beside a stranger. A man, tall, weather-worn hand resting near the pocket of his coat like he'd been preparing for this moment long before it came. "Who in the devil's name are you?" Miriam hissed, eyes narrowing on Thomas as though he were a snake coiled at her doorstep. Thomas didn't flinch. He took one slow step forward. "Name's Thomas Hale." Miriam glanced at Clara, then back at him. "You come here looking for work." "No, ma'am," he said. "Didn't come for your land, didn't come for your livestock." "Then what?" she sneered, folding her arms. "You come to steal a child." Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked down at Clara, who clutched the note in her hand like a lifeline. Her eyes flicked between the two of them, her knuckles white with tension. She'd been raised to know when to stay silent, when a single word might bring punishment. But this moment wasn't hers to control. This was a storm waiting to break. "I came," Thomas said finally, voice low, steady, "because a little girl shouldn't be sleeping with pigs." Miriam's laugh was sharp and brittle. "She's my husband's daughter, not mine. I feed her, clothe her. That's more than she deserves." Thomas' jaw tightened. No child deserves to be treated like she don't exist. Miriam stepped forward, face twisted. "She's mine, and I don't care who you think you are. If you don't leave this instant, I'll have the sheriff haul you off my property so fast you'll forget your boots." Thomas tipped his hat back. "I already spoke to the sheriff, ma'am, and I reckon he'd be mighty curious to hear what she's got to say, about the pigs, about the locked doors, about the bruises." For a split second, Miriam's mask cracked. Her mouth twitched. Her eyes flicked to Clara's arms, exposed now beneath the white cotton dress, pale and marked with faint yellowing bruises that hadn't quite faded. "You lying little brat," she snarled, stepping toward Clara. But Thomas moved faster. He stood between them, one hand out, palm flat, not threatening, not pleading, just firm. "Don't," he said. Clara didn't breathe. Neither did the barn. Miriam looked at Thomas like she might slap him, scream at him, curse him into the dirt. But something in his face stopped her. He didn't flinch. He didn't lower his eyes. And Miriam, for all her cruelty, knew when she'd met a wall that wouldn't move. She backed away. "Fine," she spat. "Take her. See how long she lasts with you." Thomas didn't move until Miriam was out of the barn. Only when the heavy slam of the house door echoed did he let out the breath he'd been holding. Clara stood frozen. "You all right?" he asked. She started, but her voice cracked. Thomas knelt. "You don't have to decide right now, but if you want to come with me, there's a place for you." Clara nodded, just once, tiny, but it was enough. They left that night. Thomas brought her to his ranch, a modest house with 2 rooms, a wide porch, and fields that stretched beyond what the eye could hold. Levi, his son, watched from the window as Thomas helped Clara down from the horse. "She gonna stay?" Levi asked. "That's up to her," Thomas replied. That first night was quiet. Clara didn't eat much. She curled up on the edge of the bed Thomas gave her, still dressed in the white cotton dress, the note folded beneath her pillow like a prayer. Thomas left the door cracked. In the middle of the night, he found her in the hallway, clutching the hem of her nightgown. "I thought I heard her voice," she whispered. Thomas knelt. "She can't hurt you here." Clara blinked. "You promise?" "I do." The days that followed weren't simple. Clara didn't speak much. She flinched when doors closed too hard. She didn't know how to laugh. Levi tried to talk to her once, asked if she wanted to play with his marbles. She stared at them like they were artifacts from another world. But slowly things shifted. She began helping with the chickens, feeding the goats, brushing Levi's pony when she thought no one was looking. She hummed under her breath, old tunes no one recognized. At night, Thomas left the lantern burning outside her door. She never asked why, but she never turned it off either. Then came the day she spilled the milk. It was an accident. The bucket tipped while she was carrying it from the barn to the porch. The glass shattered, milk soaked into the boards. Clara froze. And then, sobbing, she dropped to her knees, hands shaking, mumbling apologies over and over like the world was about to end. Thomas came running. He didn't raise his voice, didn't scold. He knelt beside her, took her wrists gently. "It's all right," he said, "just milk." She looked at him confused. "But I messed up." "We all do," he said. "But I broke something." "You didn't break me." And she cried harder than he'd ever seen a child cry. That night she asked for seconds at dinner. Levi gave her his biscuit. She smiled. Weeks passed. Then came a knock on the door. Thomas opened it to find Miriam standing there, not alone, but with a man in a gray suit and a gold badge. Her eyes lit up with triumph. "She's mine," she said, "and I'm here to take her back." Thomas stared at the sheriff. "Got any proof of abuse?" the man asked. "Because right now this woman is saying you kidnapped a child." Clara stood in the hallway, trembling. And Thomas knew they weren't safe yet. The sheriff's boots thudded heavy on Thomas Hale's porch, dust rising with each step as he tipped his hat back, eyes narrowed, brow drawn with the kind of tension that meant he didn't like this any more than Thomas did. But the badge on his chest didn't allow much room for feelings. The law was the law, and today it had come knocking. "Sheriff Madsen," he said, his voice even. "Heard there was a little girl livin' here that don't belong." Thomas stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other clenched tight at his side. Clara was behind him, barely visible through the slit in the door, but he felt her there like a shadow clinging to his heels. "She ain't property," Thomas said. "She doesn't belong to anyone." Miriam bristled behind the sheriff, arms folded, eyes gleaming with smug satisfaction. "She's my stepdaughter. My husband left her to me in the will. That makes her mine. You think you can just pick up strays off the road and play family?" "She's not a stray," Thomas said, his voice low. "She's a little girl who was sleeping in a sty." The sheriff lifted a brow. "You got proof of that?" Thomas hesitated. "I seen the bruises," he said. "Photos?" "No." "She tell you anything?" Thomas looked over his shoulder. Clara was halfway behind the wall now, clutching the hem of her dress. Her hair was freshly washed, braided back with the little yellow ribbon Levi had given her. Her eyes were wide, glassy. She hadn't spoken much since the day she spilled the milk, and Thomas knew better than to push. "She don't talk about it," he said. The sheriff sighed. "Makes it hard." Thomas stepped aside slowly. "You want to talk to her, fine, but you talk to her right, you don't scare her." Clara looked like she might bolt, but Thomas crouched and held out a hand. She stared at it for a long second before stepping forward, her bare feet nearly silent on the wood floor. The sheriff knelt, removing his hat. "Hi there, Clara. I'm Sheriff Madsen, just want to ask you something. That all right?" She didn't answer. Her mouth moved once, but no sound came. "Did you come here with Mr. Hale because you wanted to? Or did he take you without asking? Clara looked up at Thomas, then back at the sheriff. She opened her mouth. I didn't want to go back in the barn, she whispered. The sheriff blinked. What barn? Our barn, Miriam snapped. She was helping with the animals like any farm kid should. She was sleeping in it, Clara said. Her voice cracked on the word sleeping. With the pigs. They locked the house at night. I tried to stay clean, but there was mud and they made me. Enough, Miriam snapped. Clara flinched. Thomas's hand shot out, steadying her. The sheriff stood, his face unreadable. Well, he said slowly, don't look like she was dragged here. Don't look like she's in danger now. But this here's a gray area, Thomas. Technically, she's not yours. I ain't trying to own her, Thomas said. I'm trying to protect her. Then do it right, Madsen said. Go through the courts, file a petition. Let the judge decide. Until then, he glanced back at Miriam. She stays here for now. Miriam's face twisted. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. Thomas shut the door before she could finish the threat. For hours after, Clara didn't move from the chair on the porch. Levi sat beside her, quietly showing her a book about horses, tracing the lines with his finger, though she didn't look up once. The sheriff's visit had stirred something in her, something old and deep, like ashes blown from a long-dead fire. That night she woke screaming. Thomas came running. Her room was dark, save for the lamp left glowing by the window. Clara sat in the middle of the bed, hands over her ears, sobbing. She didn't say what she dreamed. She didn't need to. Thomas sat on the floor, back against the wall, and stayed until the tears stopped. I'm not gonna let her take you back, he said. You're safe here. She didn't speak, but when he left, he found a drawing on the hallway floor the next morning. Crude, childish lines, 3 stick figures. One big, 2 small, all holding hands. A week passed. Thomas went to town, papers in hand. Filing for guardianship wasn't easy. He had no blood ties, no claim but the one carved by kindness and choice. The judge scheduled a hearing 3 weeks out. She'll need to testify, the clerk said, if it comes to it. Back at the ranch, Clara began to speak more, soft words, questions mostly. What's a filly? What's a saddle made of? Do birds sleep? She followed Levi around like a second shadow, and he didn't seem to mind. They collected eggs together, brushed the goats, fed the chickens. Once, Thomas caught them sitting beneath the oak tree reading by lantern light, Clara's head on Levi's shoulder. But there were setbacks, too. One morning, Thomas found her in the barn, scrubbing the floorboards with soap and tears. She'd de-broken a jar of preserves, and though no one had yelled, she'd reacted like the sky had fallen. I can fix it, she kept saying. Thomas sat beside her. You don't have to. I have to, she cried. No, Clara, you get to try, that's different. She didn't answer, but she let go of the brush. The day of the hearing came faster than anyone wanted. Clara wore the white dress again. Thomas had mended the hem, washed out the last of the stains. She held Levi's hand as they entered the courthouse, her eyes darting across the marble floor like it might swallow her whole. Inside, Miriam waited with her lawyer, smug as ever. The judge was a tired man in wire glasses. Miss Clara, he said gently, I hear you've been staying with Mr. Hale. Is that right? She nodded. Do you want to go back with your stepmother? No, she whispered. Why not? Clara opened her mouth. Paused. Then very softly she said, because he lets me eat, and he calls me Clara, not girl, not pig. The courtroom went quiet. Thomas stared at her, breath held. The judge cleared his throat. That'll be all. Miriam rose, hissing under her breath. But when the gavel struck, it was over. Temporary guardianship granted, full review in 60 days. Outside the courtroom, Clara turned to Thomas. Does that mean I stay? He knelt beside her. For now, we take it one day at a time. Clara nodded. Then she did something that broke him clean in two. She hugged him. Tight. Without asking. Without fear. As if he had always been hers. And when they rode home that day, the wind in her hair, her laughter echoing down the dusty trail, Thomas realized something else. He was hers too. Someone raised a hand too fast, but the lines in her shoulders began to loosen. Her eyes lifted a little more often, and sometimes, just sometimes, she laughed. Not the kind of wild laughter that spilled from Levi after a prank, or the kind of practiced, polite chuckles Thomas gave to strangers in town, but a light, gentle sound that seemed surprised at itself each time it came out. Thomas would find her humming while brushing the horses, or twirling slowly in the yard when she thought no one was watching, the white dress catching the sun like a lantern wick. He never told her he saw. He just stood in the doorway with his coffee, hand on the frame, and let her be. But peace didn't last. A letter came. Folded clean, sealed in an envelope without a return address, though the handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas stared at it for a long while before he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet. Petition for reconsideration. I will not let you keep her. I know my rights. A girl like her ain't your burden to bear. There was no signature, but he didn't need one. Miriam. She was appealing the judge's decision. And worse, she'd hired someone new, someone with money and legal firepower. The kind of man who wore city shoes and pocket squares and didn't blink twice at tearing a child from the only place she'd ever felt safe. Thomas read it twice, then folded it, tucked it into the drawer beneath the stove, and didn't tell Clara. That night he went to the barn and stayed long after dark. He brushed the horses, stacked bales, oiled tack, anything to keep his hands moving. Levi found him around midnight, lantern in hand. You all right? No, Thomas said, but I will be. Is it her? Thomas nodded. She don't know yet, and she don't need to, not till we know what comes next. Can I help? You already are. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out, which meant 6 more weeks to hold everything together. The change in Clara was slow but steady. She started waking up before the rooster, eager to help with breakfast. She, Dee, asked questions, now real ones. Do goats ever get sad? Why do birds fly in V's? Do you think Mama ever loved me? That one had cut deep. Thomas set down his knife mid-chop and sat beside her on the porch steps, the smell of onions still on his fingers. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know you're easy to love. Anyone who didn't see that, they weren't looking close enough. Clara didn't cry, but she scooted closer and leaned her shoulder against his. That was enough. Then came the fire. It started in the northeast field, dry grass catching quick. No lightning, no storm, just a flicker from somewhere, maybe a discarded match, maybe something worse. Thomas was in town when it hit. Clara and Levi were at the ranch alone. By the time he saw the smoke, it was already too late to stop the worst of it. He galloped back, lungs full of ash and fear, only to find both kids standing by the trough, soaked head to toe. Clara had the pump handle in her tiny hands, trembling but determined. I saw it out the window, she said, her voice hoarse. We got the buckets. Where's Levi? In the barn. He saved the foal. Thomas ran. The fire had caught the far fence, scorched the grass to black, but the barn itself, miraculously, still stood. Levi sat inside, panting, an old feed sack wrapped around the baby colt. I ain't letting him burn, he said, as if daring Thomas to argue. Thomas didn't. He just sat beside him and let the weight settle in. Later, after the fire was out and the sky returned to its proper color, Clara came to sit on the porch with a bowl of stew. I was scared, she said. I know. but I remembered what you told me about bravery. What'd I say? That it's not about not being scared. It's about doing the thing anyway. He smiled. That sounds smart. You said it. They sat together for a while, the sun bleeding into the mountains. Then Clara turned. If they make me go back, will you still pray for me? Thomas's throat tightened. He nodded. Every day. Even if I'm far. Especially then. A week before the hearing, Levi got sick. Not just a sniffle, but fever, coughing, chills. Clara stayed by his side the entire night, wiping his head with a damp cloth, whispering stories. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She just stayed. The doctor came and said it was just a virus, but Thomas saw the way Clara's eyes stayed locked on Levi's face, like she was willing him back into the world. When he woke 3 days later, Clara fell asleep in his arms. Tell me I don't have to leave her, Levi croaked. I wish I could, Thomas said, but we're not done fighting yet. Clara didn't wake until dawn. And when she did, she smiled, just a little. Still here, she whispered. The final hearing was set for the 1st of the month. Thomas dressed in his best, Levi too. Clara wore the white dress one more time. It had been washed so many times it was starting to fray at the seams, but she wore it like it was silk. Miriam was already there. So was the new lawyer, slick, polished, the kind of man who'd never know what a pigsty smelled like or how quiet a little girl could get when you mentioned bedtime. He called Clara a financial burden. He called Thomas a sympathetic opportunist. He called the ranch an unsuitable home for a delicate girl. And when it was Clara's turn to speak, he leaned in like a vulture. Do you really believe Mr. Hale is fit to raise you? Clara looked at him, then at Thomas, then at the judge. She stepped down from the stand, walked across the courtroom and took Thomas's hand. I don't think he's fit, she said softly. I know he's family. Gasps rippled through the room. The judge leaned forward. And why is that, Clara? She didn't hesitate. Because when I was too scared to talk, he listened anyway. When I was dirty, he gave me clean clothes. When I was hungry, he gave me food. And when I broke things, he never broke me back. Miriam stood up, face blotched red. This is absurd. Sit down, the judge said. And she did. The courtroom fell quiet. The gavel came down. Full guardianship awarded to Mr. Thomas Hale. Outside, the wind was sharp. Clara held Thomas's hand all the way to the wagon. Can we go home now? He smiled. We're already there. And as the sun slipped behind the hills, and Levi let out a cheer that echoed across the fields, Clara turned in her seat, looked up at Thomas, and asked a question that turned his world inside out. Can I call you Papa? He didn't answer with words. He just nodded, choked by something deep in his chest. Something that had been empty for far too long. The word hung in the air like a candle, refusing to blow out. Papa. Thomas hadn't heard that title in years. Not from a neighbor's kid, not from a stranger in town, and certainly not in the hush of a child's voice that was finally learning what safety felt like. Clara didn't press him for an answer. She didn't need to. When he knelt beside the wagon and cupped her face in his weathered hands, she leaned into them like they were the first things in the world that ever touched her gently. He whispered, "You can call me anything you want," and her smile was the only reply he needed. They rode back toward the ranch with the wind at their backs and dust curling off the road like a ribbon unraveling. Levi dozed in the seat beside her, head bobbing against the side rail. His cough was nearly gone, his fever broken. Clara watched him with the fierce stillness of someone who'd learned what it meant to lose before they even understood what they had. When they passed the fork in the road, the one that led back to town and the courtroom and the woman Clara had stopped calling Mama months ago, Thomas flicked the reins just a little tighter and kept going. Clara never looked back. Life at the ranch shifted again, quietly, like snow melting beneath sunlight. Clara had a room of her own now. She picked a blue quilt from the general store that matched the sky on mornings when the fog cleared fast, and she folded it every night without fail. Not because anyone told her to, but because it was hers, and no one could take it. Thomas started noticing new things. The way Clara set an extra plate at the table sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, or how she'd tuck her toys away in a neat little pile, as if expecting someone else to need the space. She was still learning that she could take up space, that the world wouldn't collapse if she left her shoes by the door or sang too loud while feeding the hens. Levi teased her gently like an older brother. He showed her how to tie rope knots and how to listen for the distant call of coyotes. But when he caught her crying one night, quietly under the stairs, he didn't ask questions. He just sat beside her and handed her a tin of cookies he'd swiped from the kitchen. They didn't talk about the past, but the silence held something sacred. Thomas never spoke of Miriam again, not to Clara, not to Levi, and when he saw her in town a few weeks later, alone, shoulders stiff with bitterness, he tipped his hat and walked right on by. The woman who'd once called Clara a stain on her family name had lost her last claim to control, and Thomas wasn't about to offer her even a sliver of power back. But peace never came without price. The ranch was struggling. Rain hadn't come in weeks. The creek bed that once shimmered like a mirror had dried to cracked mud. The cattle were restless. Feed prices had gone up and Thomas's savings were thin. He didn't complain. He never did. But some nights Clara woke to hear him pacing downstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath the weight of 1,000 thoughts. She'd tiptoe down with a blanket and wrap it around his shoulders. He'd pretend he didn't hear her coming, but his eyes always softened when she arrived. One night he sat her down. "You know I love having you here, right?" Clara nodded, too fast, like the question alone scared her. "But things might get a little harder before they get easier." She blinked. "Are you sending me away?" Thomas shook his head firm. "No, sweetheart, I'm telling you because you deserve to know. This is your home, too, and we face things together here." Clara's eyes welled. "Even the hard things." "Especially the hard things." She crawled into his lap and stayed there for a long time. He didn't move. Didn't breathe too loud. Just held her. That week Thomas made the hardest call of all. He sold his horse. It wasn't just any horse, it was her horse, Maria's. A paint mare with a temperament as gentle as a hymn. She hadn't been ridden much since Maria passed, but Thomas brushed her daily, kept her stall clean, and talked to her sometimes like she could still carry secrets. Clara found him in the barn, silent as he slipped the bridle on for the last time. "Why?" she asked, voice paper-thin. "Because we need the money more than we need the memory." Clara didn't speak for a moment. Then she stepped forward, lifted her hand, and laid it against the mare's neck. "Thank you," she whispered. To the horse. To the past. To the life she was no longer trapped in. The buyer came from 2 towns over, paid cash, drove off with the mare and didn't say a word about the tears streaking Thomas's face. Clara watched from the porch. She didn't cry. But that night, she curled up in bed with the old locket Maria had left behind. Thomas had given it to her after the court ruling, without saying much. Inside was a photo, not of Maria but of Thomas, younger, laughing, arms wrapped around a woman with a smile brighter than any flame. Clara pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. A week later the rains came. Not a drizzle. A downpour. Water poured from the sky like grace itself, filling the cracked soil, washing the dust from rooftops. Clara ran barefoot through the yard, dress soaked, hair plastered to her cheeks. Levi followed, slipping once in the mud and laughing so hard it echoed through the hills. Thomas stood in the barn doorway, rain in his beard, hands raised just slightly, like he was catching something invisible. Hoping. Maybe mercy. Maybe both. When Clara reached him, she held out her hands. Come run with us. He hesitated, then stepped into the storm. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of loss on his shoulders. He felt something else, something rising from the roots of his boots to the top of his spine. Belonging. Later that night, with the fire crackling and stew on the stove, Clara looked up from her bowl. Can we invite people next week? People. For dinner, so they know we're a family now. Thomas blinked. You want folks to know? Clara nodded. They should. Some people still think I don't belong here. Well, Thomas said slowly, maybe it's time they learn. And so they did. They invited the preacher and his wife, the school teacher, the boy who sold newspapers, a few more neighbors than Thomas expected to say yes. The table was packed. The food stretched just far enough. And when someone asked how Clara came to be with Thomas, she answered without blinking. He found me in the dirt, she said, but he never treated me like I was from there. A hush settled, then someone raised a glass. To new families. They all echoed it. But Thomas just looked at Clara and whispered to you. The weeks that followed were stitched together like a patchwork quilt, bits of warmth and worry, comfort and challenge, all held together by the quiet resilience of three hearts slowly learning how to beat as one. Clara started school that month. It wasn't easy. Not because she wasn't smart. Thomas had already learned she could do sums in her head faster than he could write them down, but because walking into a room full of strangers who all whispered when she passed took more courage than any child should need. The first day she came home without saying a word. Her dress was wrinkled, her hair still neatly braided, but her silence clung to her like a second skin. Levi asked her how it went. She shook her head. Thomas didn't press. He just placed a glass of milk and a biscuit in front of her and sat across the table, waiting. Finally, her lips parted. One girl said, I must have been bad if my family gave me away. Thomas didn't blink. Do you think that's true? Clara's chin trembled. No. Then it is. She didn't cry. She just took the biscuit, broke it in half, and pushed the bigger piece across to Levi. That night, Thomas stayed up late writing a letter to the teacher, not to accuse or scold, just to explain. A little girl's world had been broken and pieced back together again, and she needed more than arithmetic to survive it. The next morning, the teacher met Clara at the door. She knelt down, adjusted the collar of Clara's dress, and said, We're lucky to have you. That day, Clara came home with a crayon drawing of her family. It was simple. One tall man, one boy, one girl. The man was smiling. The boy was holding a stick with a pretend sword on it. The girl had a big red heart on her chest. Thomas put it on the fridge. It stayed there for years. Meanwhile, the ranch was healing too. Rain had come, and with it, a kind of rebirth. The fields, once brittle and gray, shimmered with green. The cattle fattened. The hens laid more eggs than they had in seasons. There were still days Thomas had to stretch $1 until it squeaked, but there was breathing room now. Enough to let the windows stay open longer and the laughter grow louder. Levi and Clara made it their mission to repair the old treehouse. Thomas had built it back when Miriam still had hope they'd be parents someday. It had stood empty for years, a ghost of what never was. Now it echoed with hammering and giggling, boards nailed too crooked and rope ladders tied too loose. But it held. Like them. They planted flowers beneath the windows, marigolds and daisies, and one crooked sunflower that leaned too far east but bloomed defiantly anyway. Levi carved their initials into the old oak out front. Not just his and Clara's, but Thomas's too. He did it without asking permission. Just came inside one day, covered in bark dust, and said, "That tree belongs to all of us now." Thomas stared at the carving for a long while, then nodded. Then came the visit. Unexpected, unwelcome, and unavoidably tied to the past. Miriam. She arrived in a carriage cleaner than any shoe that had stepped on their land in years. Her gloves were white, her hair pinned back so tightly it looked painful. She stepped out like a woman walking through ash she didn't want to touch. Thomas saw her from the window. He didn't move. Clara stepped beside him, a half-eaten apple in her hand. Her face paled. "Do I have to talk to her?" "No," he said quietly. But Miriam wasn't here for Clara. She was here for Thomas. They stood on the porch, separated by a gulf wider than years could measure. She didn't ask to come in. He didn't invite her. "I heard," she said. Thomas didn't reply. "You took her in, that girl. She's got a name." Miriam exhaled sharply. "You always did have a way of latching onto broken things." Thomas's jaw tightened. "And you always had a way of throwing them away." Her eyes flared. "I didn't come here to fight." "Then why did you come?" She faltered for the first time. "I made a mistake," she said. "Back then, I panicked. I thought we'd be better off without the reminder." "You mean the child?" She flinched. "I came to say I'm sorry." Thomas didn't expect that, not from her, not ever. "And—" She stepped down from the porch. "And to tell you, she looks happy." "She is. She's lucky." "No," Thomas said, voice firm. "We're the lucky ones." Miriam looked at him, not with anger, not even with sorrow, but with something like acceptance. Then she got back in the carriage and left. Clara never asked what they talked about. And Thomas never offered. Some things belong to the silence. One evening, Clara found a bird with a broken wing near the barn. She wrapped it in cloth, fed it crumbs, and checked on it every hour like it was her own kin. When Thomas told her it might not survive, she whispered, "But what if it does?" The bird lived, flapped its wings, and flew again 3 days later, leaving behind an empty nest on the windowsill. Clara watched it disappear into the sky, hand lifted, eyes bright. "She came back," Levi said, pointing days later to a bird that looked just like it. "Maybe," Clara whispered, "or maybe she sent a friend." Thomas ruffled her hair. "Either way," he said, "you gave her a reason to try." Clara looked up at him, "Like you did for me." He didn't answer. Didn't need to. Then came the day Thomas got sick. It started small, a cough, a shadow beneath the skin. He hid it well, too well. By the time Clara noticed, he was already tired all the time. His hands shook, his appetite vanished. He said it was just the flu. She didn't believe him. Neither did Levi. They pressed him, begged him. He sat them down, finally, the same way he'd sat Clara down once before. "It's not the flu." Silence. "How bad?" Levi asked, voice tight. Thomas swallowed hard. "I don't know yet." Clara climbed into his lap and buried her face against his chest. "I don't want you to go." "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, even if it was a promise he couldn't be sure he could keep. "We're not letting you," Levi said. And that was that. They nursed him through it. Every day, Clara made tea with too much honey. Levi read aloud from books Thomas never finished. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles, advice, and prayer. The preacher came twice a week, not just to offer scripture, but to sit with Thomas, quietly, like a friend who knew how to listen when hope felt thin. Clara refused to sleep in her room some nights. She made a pallet on the floor beside his bed, one hand always curled around his. And when the pain got too much, and Thomas thought maybe it was time to start saying goodbye, she'd whisper, "You saved me, now it's my turn." He would weep then, softly, because somehow, this little girl who had been discarded and beaten down by the world had become his greatest reason to fight. And that fight wasn't over. Spring came slower than usual that year. The ground thawed reluctantly, and the trees along the edge of Thomas's land took longer to bloom. Even the robins hesitated in their return, as if waiting to be certain that hope was welcome again. Inside the house, the days had a rhythm all their own, a quiet symphony of care and sacrifice. Clara woke early every morning to help make breakfast, always placing Thomas's mug just so beside his favorite chair. Levi did the heavy lifting, feeding the animals, fixing fences, keeping the ranch afloat. He wasn't a boy anymore, not quite yet a man, but something was growing in him: grit, strength, and an ache to protect what was his. Thomas had good days and bad ones. Some mornings he could rise with a grunt, walk out to the porch, and sit in the sun while Clara read from her storybook. On those days, the pain dulled just enough to let him believe he might live forever, or at least long enough to watch her grow. But there were nights too. Long, sleepless nights when the fire couldn't touch the chill in his bones. Nights where breathing felt like dragging bricks through his lungs. Levi would wake at the sound of coughing, and without a word, bring the water and hold his father's back as the spasms rattled through him. They didn't talk about dying. Not because they were pretending it wasn't real, but because hope had become its own form of rebellion, a choice they made each hour, each heartbeat. The doctors had said he had a chance, small, fragile, but real, and that was all Clara needed. She stuck drawings everywhere, on the mirror, the pantry door, even his boots. Pictures of him smiling, her laughing, Levi swinging her in circles. There was one where she drew a big house with flowers all around and stick figures in front. Her, Levi, Thomas, and a dog they didn't yet own, but she was certain they would. Hope wasn't just rebellion. It was love in its most stubborn form. Then came the envelope. Levi found it buried beneath a pile of hay bales in the barn. A wrinkled, half-torn thing addressed in a woman's hand neither of them recognized. He brought it to Thomas, unsure. Inside, a letter. "Dear Thomas, if you're reading this, then you've made it further than I ever thought you would. I'm writing not because I expect forgiveness, but because I owe you the truth. After I left, I spent years trying to convince myself that what I did was necessary, that you were too attached, too broken to know what was best. I see now I was wrong. About you, about everything. Clara is." The ink smudged there, as if tears or weather had worn the rest away. Thomas sat very still. Clara stood at the door, watching. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but she didn't leave. She didn't ask what it said. And he didn't tell her. Some truths didn't need retelling, not when they'd already been rewritten by love. The day Thomas finally stood unassisted for the first time in months, Clara cried. Not because she was scared, but because she was proud. Levi had gone into town to fetch supplies, and it was just the two of them. She came running from the back porch, saw him standing in the doorway without the cane, and froze. "You're up." He grinned. "You're observant." She flung her arms around him, and hugged so tight he had to sit before he fell. "You're not allowed to leave," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." "Promise." His hand brushed her hair. "Not as long as I can help it." She nodded fiercely, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "What's this?" "Levi helped me write it." He unfolded it. A certificate. Clumsily drawn, the letters large and crooked. Official certificate of being a papa. Awarded to Thomas. Reason: because you didn't let go, even when everyone else did. His throat closed. "You spelled official wrong," he managed. I was 5 when I started it, she said. He folded it slowly, pressed it to his chest. Then it's perfect. That summer, the treehouse became their kingdom. They added windows, a second floor, barely stable but charmingly ambitious. Clara painted flowers along the walls, and Levi built a lookout using salvaged wood from the old barn. It wasn't just a play place. It was a testament to everything they'd survived. On Clara's birthday, Thomas managed to climb up the rope ladder. It took a full 10 minutes and left him breathless, but when he sat down between them, grinning like a boy himself, Clara kissed his cheek and said it was her best birthday ever. They roasted apples over a tiny fire pit Levi built on the ground, and Thomas told stories from his childhood. He skipped the hard parts, the hungry parts, the years before Miriam, before Clara. Some things were better rewritten in the telling. One day in early fall, a man rode up to the ranch on a black horse. He wore a sheriff's badge and carried a letter bearing the state seal. Levi answered the door. I'm looking for Thomas Everett. Why? Legal matter. Thomas came, shoulders stiff. The sheriff tipped his hat. It's about the girl, Clara. What about her? She has a grandmother, maternal, back east. Been trying to find her for years. She just filed for custody. Thomas didn't speak. I'm not saying anything's changing. Just be prepared. There'll be a hearing. When? Month from now. He rode off, and Levi closed the door. Clara stood at the top of the stairs, a doll in her hands. She looked down at them both, eyes wide. Thomas held out his hand. She came running. They prepared. Letters from teachers, neighbors, the preacher. Every single one said the same thing: Clara belonged here. So did she. At the hearing, Clara wore her best dress, the white one Thomas had given her, the one that made her look like hope personified. Levi sat beside her, holding her hand. Thomas faced the judge without flinching. When asked why he thought he should keep her, he said, "Because she saved my life when I didn't know I needed saving. Because every morning she gives me a reason to keep breathing. Because I'm not just willing to be her father, I already am." The judge asked Clara where she wanted to live. She stood tall, voice clear. "With my family." The court ruled in their favor. That night Thomas built a fire in the yard. They sat around it, wrapped in blankets, eating burnt marshmallows. Clara looked up at the stars. "Do you think Mama sees us?" "I do," Thomas said. "What do you think she'd say?" He paused. "I think she'd say, 'Well done.'" Clara leaned her head against his arm. "Do you think we'll ever have a dog?" Levi chuckled. "That's your concern after a custody battle." She nodded. Thomas smiled. "We'll see what tomorrow brings." She yawned. "I hope tomorrow brings a puppy." Thomas laughed. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't hurt to breathe. The sun had long since risen over the hills, spilling golden light across the Wexler ranch, but Josiah wasn't moving like he used to. His bones were slower now, his shoulders stooped more than the year before. He stood out by the fence, leaning against the rails, watching as Caleb and Lydia ran after a loose chicken near the coop. Their laughter echoed across the field like music. 3 years had passed. 3 whole years since that girl in a white dress stepped over the threshold and into his home, into their lives. And it hadn't been perfect. There were nightmares, especially in the beginning. Times Lydia would scream in her sleep or flinch at raised voices, even if they weren't angry. Times Caleb didn't know how to share his father. Times Josiah didn't know how to carry the weight of someone else's scars when he was still healing his own. But family wasn't perfect. It was choosing each other anyway. Josiah had watched them change, watched Lydia grow into something bold and kind, watched Caleb become a brother in ways that mattered more than blood. He still remembered the first time Lydia had gone to school in a clean dress and come home with a picture of a barn she'd drawn just for him. It was crooked, the lines were all wrong, but she'd written one word at the bottom in careful, uneven handwriting. Home. He hadn't cried then, but he'd sat with the drawing in his hands for an hour and didn't speak a word. This morning, Lydia came up behind him and tapped his hand. "You forgot your tea," she said, holding out a mug she'd carried all the way from the kitchen with both hands. The steam rose gently. He smiled and took it, patting her head. "Thank you, sweetheart." She didn't run off right away. She stood beside him, looking out at the field where Caleb had finally cornered the chicken, his hair a mess, his arms wide as he ran. "Pa, him, do you think people can change?" He turned to her slowly. "Why do you ask that?" She shrugged, eyes squinting toward the sun. "Just been thinking. Some people are mean, they don't listen, but I used to think I wasn't worth nothing either, and then I met you." Josiah swallowed hard, his throat thick. "I think people forget they can still be good," she added, "even if nobody's ever been good to them." He set the mug down on the fence post and crouched beside her. "You've been thinking some mighty big thoughts, haven't you?" She smiled, then frowned. "Will I always remember the bad stuff?" "You might," he said honestly, "but it won't always hurt the same." She nodded like she already knew that, then tilted her head. "What if someone else is like I was, like still waiting, still scared?" Josiah looked out over the land, the place he'd once believed was only for him and his ghosts. He saw now what he hadn't before, not emptiness but space, not silence but the quiet that comes after music, promising more. "Then we help 'em," he said, "same way you helped me." Lydia's hand slipped into his. They stood that way a while. No noise but the wind, the rustle of grass, and the sound of childhood nearby. Eventually, Caleb wandered back, his arms full of feathers and frustration. "She got away again," he grumbled. "That hen's smarter than me." Lydia giggled. "You say that like it's hard." Josiah chuckled and opened his arms. They both ran into them. And in that moment, in the press of small hands against his back, in the feel of sunlight on his face, Josiah Wexler understood something he hadn't known the day his wife died, or the day he found a girl sleeping in filth, or the first time he'd been called Pa in a whisper. He wasn't alone. And he never would be again. And